Hello viewers. So in our last video we learned what to do if you have the white pieces. Now we'll learn how to play black. So let's say they start by playing the queen's pawn to d4. And you can play knight to f6 is what I recommend. So most common move here is pawn to c4, trying to gain some more territory and control the center. And here I recommend playing pawn to e6. So there are a lot of different move orders here, and some of the more advanced players do give a lot of thought to what's the most accurate move order. If you're just a beginner though, let's not worry about that too much. So white can play the knight to c3, or they could play the knight out to f3. It'll probably be very similar. And now I recommend let's play d5. This is the Queen's Gambit, which you probably got you started on chess if you saw the popular series. So white plays knight f3. We can play the bishop out to e7, preparing the castle. And most popular move here is bishop to g5. Some people also play bishop f4 instead, but for us it'll be very similar. We'll play the same kind of system against both of those moves. And now we castle, bringing our king to safety. And white can play pawn to e3, protecting the c4 pawn. So you might have been wondering, that pawn c4 was hanging for several moves in a row. Why didn't we just take it? The problem is if you take on c4 is that then white can play pawn to e4 instead, and it'll probably end up regaining that pawn anyways. So you won't actually win a pawn, you'll just get it temporarily, then have to give it back, and you'll end up giving white a lot of control of the center. So that's why I don't recommend taking that pawn. There are some ways where you can take the pawn safely, but they're a bit more complicated. I don't recommend them if you're just starting out. Just play this system instead. So now we challenge the bishop and ask it where it wants to go. The most common response here is to bring the bishop back, and then we play our pawn up to b6, thinking about bringing our bishop out to b7. So what we're going to do here is to play the bishop out to b7, and we'll want to bring our pawn up to c5 after some preparation. So for example, if white goes bishop d3, let's play bishop b7, castle, and then over there we'll play c5 shortly. White doesn't always play bishop d3. They might play pawn takes d5 instead. In that case, I advise you to recapture with the pawn, and then again, very similar ideas. Bring out your pieces, and then play your pawn up to c5. So that gets you a solid position. You're not going to get wiped out in the first 15 moves or anything like that. So some players will prefer to, white will prefer to avoid the Queen's Gambit, and they might play something else instead. They might play the knight out to f3. And I'll tell you a universal system that works against a lot of these variations. So one popular approach among amateurs is the London system, where white plays bishop f4. But the same idea we'll show you here also works against bishop g5 and also works against e3 and other stuff. So we'll play pawn to c5, attacking the center. So white will often reinforce the pawn by playing e3, and then we'll play b6, preparing to bring our bishop out to b7 and also get some control of the center. So white usually prefers to play knight to d2 here instead of knight to c3. That's because white wants to play the pawn to c3 in order to reinforce the center. So he doesn't want to block that square with his knight by playing a knight out here. So we follow along their plan, bring out the bishop, and then c3. Let's trade pawns in the center, and then play our bishop out. So this setup is known as the hedgehog. It's a very, very solid system for black. You can see that white's going to have some difficulty in breaking down your position. So here's what I like about the hedgehog. I played it for a long time. Among a lot of amateurs, they have basically one idea, which is attack, attack, attack. They want to play things like knight e5, and then they might play g4 and g5 and bring out their queen and just try to checkmate you in the king side very quickly. Well, if you play your pawn at d6, like we do in a hedgehog, then white can't play knight e5. And if white can't play knight e5, this whole attack just never gets started. And a lot of these amateurs who only know attack, 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 when they can't attack, they just don't know what to do. I've had a lot of opponents who just end up maneuvering aimlessly in this position, and I get a very nice game. So here's what you're going to want to do in the system. You want a castle, and you want to eventually try to play for e5. So you'll bring a rook over here to e8. You'll drop back your bishop. Your other rook wants to go to the c file, where it's going to have some more prospects than would over here in the corner. You might have to play your pawn up here and bring out your bishop to g7 to reinforce e5. You might have to bring your queen out to c7. So if you do all that, you should be pretty safe. So that's how we handle pawn to d4. Now some people play pawn to c4, or they might play the knight to f3. In either case, here's what you can do. You can play pawn to e6, and then after knight out, you can bring up the pawn. After d4, we're back in the queen's gambit. And the same system would work if they played knight f3 first and then played c4 later. You still play the same setup. You go for the queen's gambit. Alright, so now let's talk about what if they play the king's pawn. They play pawn to e4. A lot of beginners play pawn to e5, but I'm actually recommending to not go for that. It's a fine move, of course, totally respectable. It's played by a lot of elite players, but for a beginner, there are a lot of gambits to worry about after pawn to e5. So, for example, you got to worry about the king's gambit, and there's the Danish gambit, and there's also let's see, I think this one is called the Goring gambit, if memory serves. So those are just three gambits I can think of off the top of my head. These gambits, while objectively not very good, they are complicated. You really do have to be prepared and memorize a fair amount of stuff to make sure you survive the opening. So it's a perfectly good line, but just you gotta put in some work to make sure you don't get blown off the board. So that's why I recommend don't play pawn to e5 if you're just starting out. Play a Sicilian instead. Now, some coaches might get scared. Sicilian has a reputation for being somewhat complicated, but there are some variations of the Sicilian that are actually not too hard to play. I'm going to try to steer you towards the ones that are not too complicated. We'll talk more about the Sicilian in the next video, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss that.